The first threat came in the form of a casserole dish. Margaret Voss had lived on Cedar Hollow Farm for 34 years, and in all that time, she'd learned that in rural Idaho, hostility rarely announced itself directly. It arrived wrapped in aluminum foil, delivered with a smile, and left on your porch step with a note that read like a warning disguised as neighborly concern. Thought you could use this, dear. Also, that dead tree in your east pasture is an eyesore and a liability. The county's been asking questions. Just thought you should know. Carol Margaret stood on her porch that October afternoon, the casserole cooling in her hands, and looked out across 400 acres of rolling grassland toward the skeletal silhouette standing alone in the far pasture. The tree had been dead for at least 8 years. A massive old ponderosa pine, silvered and stripped of bark, its branches reaching up like something frozen mid-scream. It had been dying long before her husband Daniel passed, and it would likely still be standing long after every person currently gossiping about it in the Cedar Hollow feed store was dust themselves. She had buried Daniel 7 months ago. Cancer, fast and cruel, the kind that gives you just enough time to say goodbye and not nearly enough time to prepare for what comes after. And what came after, Margaret was discovering, was not merely grief. It was scrutiny. It was every decision she made about their farm. Now, apparently, her farm, a phrase people kept using like it was a diagnosis, being weighed, measured, and found wanting by people who had opinions about land they didn't own. She set the casserole down on the kitchen counter, untouched, and poured herself a glass of water she didn't drink. Outside the window, the dead pine stood exactly where it had always stood, indifferent to the controversy it had become. She had no idea, standing there in her quiet kitchen with aching feet and a heart still raw at the edges, that the tree was about to save her farm, and that in less than 3 weeks, a stranger with a government badge would walk up her driveway and change the entire trajectory of her life. 2 weeks earlier, it had started, as these things often do, at the Cedar Hollow Grange Hall during the monthly meeting of the Cascade Valley Landowners Association, an organization Margaret had attended faithfully for over 3 decades, first at Daniel's side, and now, for the first time, alone. She'd almost not gone. The empty seat beside her at the long folding table felt like its own kind of grief. A physical absence that made the whole room seem to hold its breath whenever she sat down. But Daniel had always said the Grange meetings were where farmers took care of each other, shared advice on drought-resistant seed, warned each other about coyote packs moving through, organized barn raisings when someone's roof caved under snow load. Margaret needed that community now more than ever. She just didn't expect the community to turn on her within 20 minutes of the gavel falling. "I'll just say it, since nobody else wants to," said Dwayne Halloran, a heavy-set man who ran the cattle operation 2 properties over, and had, in the 30 years Margaret had known him, never once said anything he didn't want to say. "That dead tree on the Voss place. It's a hazard. First good windstorm. It's coming down on somebody's fence, somebody's cattle, maybe somebody's kid on a 4-wheeler, and it's just sitting there taking up good pasture." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Margaret felt her face go hot. "It's not taking up anything," she said, keeping her voice level. "It's one tree in a 400-acre pasture. The cattle graze around it fine." "It's not about the grazing, Margaret," said Carol Ann Pruitt, who ran the feed store with her husband and considered herself, by virtue of being the first to know everyone's business, an authority on everyone's business. "It's about property maintenance. Dead trees fall, and when they fall on a fence line that runs along Dwayne's property, It's 40 yards from the fence line. Still, Carol Ann folded her hands primly on the table. There's also the fire risk to consider. Dead wood, dry summer, one lightning strike. It's a solid pine trunk, not a brush pile. Margaret. Dwayne leaned forward, and something in his tone shifted from neighborly concern to something closer to a threat, though he'd have denied it if she'd called it that to his face. Daniel's gone now, and I understand this is hard, but maybe it's time to think practically about running that place. A woman alone can't let things slide the way. I am not letting things slide. Margaret's voice cut through the hall with more force than she intended, and the room went quiet. She looked around at the faces, some sympathetic, most simply avoiding her eyes, and felt for the first time in longer than she could admit, something other than grief. She felt anger, clean and sharp, cutting through months of numbness like sunlight through fog. That tree has stood in that pasture longer than most of you have owned your land. It was there when Daniel and I bought this place in 1992. It's been dead for years, and it hasn't hurt a single soul, a single cow, or a single fence post. I don't see why it suddenly needs to come down now. Because now you're alone out there, Dwayne said, not unkindly, but not gently either. And people worry. People worry, Margaret thought bitterly on the drive home that night, headlights cutting through the dark ribbon of County Road. Or people want an excuse to remind a widow that she's being watched. She wasn't naive. She understood the undercurrent beneath Dwayne's concern. Cedar Hollow, like 100 small towns scattered across the rural West, ran on unspoken rules about who belonged and who was merely tolerated. A woman running 400 acres alone, refusing advice from men who'd farmed longer than she'd been alive, was already a mild scandal. A woman who argued back at a Grange meeting was worse, but there was something else too. Something she couldn't quite name yet, some instinct rooted deeper than stubbornness. She thought of Daniel, 7 months gone, and the last conversation they'd had about that pasture, back when he could still walk out to it himself. "Leave the snag alone, Mags," he'd told her, leaning on his cane, squinting up at the skeletal branches against a September sky. "Your grandfather always said a dead tree's got more life in it than a live one, if you know how to look." She hadn't understood what he meant then. She wasn't entirely sure she understood it now. But it had been one of the last full sentences he'd said to her before the disease took his breath away in earnest, and something about the memory made the tree feel less like a hazard and more like a headstone she wasn't ready to let anyone knock over. She decided right there in the truck that the tree was staying. She had no idea that decision would nearly cost her everything, or that it would ultimately be the thing that saved her farm. The pressure didn't stop with the casserole. Within a week, a certified letter arrived from the County Code Enforcement Office, citing an anonymous complaint about a dead standing tree posing potential hazard to livestock and adjacent properties, and requesting an inspection. Margaret knew exactly who had made the call. She could practically hear Carol Ann's voice dictating the complaint to whoever answered the phone at the county office. Then came the visit from Dwayne himself, unannounced, standing in her driveway with his hat in his hands in a gesture that might have looked apologetic if his words hadn't been so pointed. "I'm not trying to make trouble for you, Margaret," he said, "but the association's talking about a formal review of maintenance standards for the whole valley. If your place gets cited for the tree, it could affect grazing lease agreements, insurance rates for the co-op, the whole deal. People are looking out for the community here. People are looking for a reason to tell a widow what to do with her own land," Margaret said, and watched his jaw tighten. "That's not fair, isn't it?" He didn't answer that. He put his hat back on and left, and Margaret stood in her driveway for a long time afterward, staring at the dead pine on the horizon, wondering if she was about to lose a fight she didn't fully understand the terms of. That night, unable to sleep, she pulled out an old wooden box from the closet. Daniel's box, full of receipts and photographs and farm records going back decades, searching for anything that might explain his strange devotion to a dead tree. She found old ledgers, seed catalogs, a photograph of the two of them standing in front of the barn the year they bought the place, young and sunburned and unaware of everything that lay ahead. And then, tucked into a manila folder near the bottom, she found something that made her sit back on her heels. A faded field notebook, water-stained at the corners, filled with Daniel's cramped handwriting. Bird sightings, dates, notes about a large owl, gray-brown distinctive facial disc, spotted repeatedly near the Big Snag, East Pasture, over a span of nearly 15 years. Margaret's breath caught. She wasn't a bird watcher. She'd never paid much attention to the wildlife beyond the practical concerns of a working ranch. Coyotes near the calving pens, hawks near the chicken coop. But Daniel had always loved the birds. He used to sit on the back porch in the evening with an old pair of binoculars watching the tree line, and she'd assumed it was simple relaxation, the quiet habit of a tired man at the end of a long day. She hadn't realized he'd been keeping records. The next morning, she drove out to the pasture herself for the first time in months, walking the quarter-mile from the truck through frost-stiffened grass, her breath clouding in the cold October air. She stood beneath the dead pine and looked up, really looked, at the massive hollowed cavity near the top where a limb had broken away years ago, leaving a dark, weathered opening in the trunk. And there, nestled in the shadow of that cavity, she saw feathers, movement. A pair of enormous dark eyes blinking down at her from a broad, mottled face. She didn't know in that moment exactly what she was looking at, but she knew with the sudden clarity of someone who has just stumbled onto something far bigger than themselves that this was not an ordinary bird. And she knew, standing in that frozen pasture with her husband's field notebook tucked under her arm, that everything was about to change. Margaret was not a woman who did things halfway. Within 2 days, she found the number for the regional office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and left a message describing what she'd seen, along with the details from Daniel's notebook. She half expected no response at all, or perhaps a form letter thanking her for her interest. What she got 4 days later was a phone call from a wildlife biologist named Renata Cho, who asked so many rapid, precise questions about the bird's coloring, call, and behavior that Margaret found herself flustered trying to keep up. "I'd like to come out and take a look, if that's all right," Renata said. "This week, if possible." She arrived on a gray Thursday morning in a government-issued truck, federal insignia stamped discreetly on the door. And Margaret watched from her porch as Carol Ann Pruitt's ancient sedan slowed conspicuously on the county road before speeding up again. By nightfall, Margaret had no doubt all of Cedar Hollow would know a federal vehicle had been parked in her driveway. Renata Cho turned out to be nothing like the stiff bureaucrat Margaret had braced herself for. She was maybe 40, dressed in worn field clothes and scuffed boots, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had spent far more time in forests than in offices. She carried a spotting scope, a notebook not unlike Daniel's, and an expression of quiet, focused excitement that only grew as Margaret led her out to the pasture. "Tell me again exactly what you saw," Renata said as they walked, her eyes already scanning the tree line ahead. Margaret described the eyes, the mottled coloring, the size of the bird relative to the cavity opening. Renata's pace quickened. And your husband's notes? He described a gray-brown owl with a distinctive facial disc seen repeatedly at this same location over multiple years. 15 years, at least, based on the dates, Margaret said. I didn't even know he kept records until a few nights ago. They reached the base of the dead pine, and Renata set up her scope with practiced efficiency, angling it up toward the cavity. For a long moment, she said nothing at all, simply looking, adjusting the focus with small, careful movements. Then she straightened, and Margaret saw something shift in her face. Professional composure, cracking just slightly around the edges of what looked unmistakably like genuine wonder. Mrs. Voss, Renata said carefully, I need you to understand what you're looking at. She explained it slowly, deliberately, the way someone explains something they know is about to upend a person's entire understanding of their own property. The bird nesting in that cavity was a northern spotted owl, Strix occidentalis corina, a species that had once ranged across old-growth forests throughout the Pacific Northwest and parts of the northern Rockies, but which had suffered catastrophic population decline over the past half-century due to habitat loss, logging, and competition from invasive barred owls. It had been listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act since 1990. They need very specific conditions to nest, Renata explained, still looking up at the cavity with something like reverence. Old, decaying trees with natural cavities, usually near water and open foraging ground. Their range in Idaho is extremely limited. This far from the core population, honestly, I'd have said it was nearly impossible. But your husband's notes, combined with what I'm seeing right now, strongly suggest this pair, or a lineage of this species, has been using this exact tree as a nesting site for at least a decade and a half, possibly longer. Margaret felt something cold and vast open up in her chest, somewhere between disbelief and awe. So the tree. This tree is one of the most significant pieces of habitat I've encountered in this region in my entire career, Renata said, and Mrs. Voss, under federal law, that nest, and likely a protective buffer around this tree, is protected. Disturbing it, let alone removing the tree itself while it's actively occupied, would constitute a federal offense under the Endangered Species Act. This isn't a county code issue anymore. This is federal jurisdiction. Margaret stood very still in the cold pasture wind, staring up at a tree her neighbors had spent weeks calling worthless, and felt an emotion she hadn't expected, a fierce, unfamiliar swell of vindication, tangled up with grief for a husband who had apparently known all along exactly what he was protecting, and had simply never gotten the chance to tell her why. Daniel knew, she said quietly. He must have known for years. Renata glanced at her. It's possible he suspected. Ranchers spend more time on their land than almost anyone. Sometimes they notice things the rest of us miss entirely. She paused. I'll need to file a formal habitat assessment, and depending on what we find, this could trigger some real protections, and possibly some real opportunities for your property. Word travels fast in small towns, and word about a federal wildlife biologist spending 3 consecutive days combing Margaret Voss's East Pasture with survey equipment and a truck full of government gear traveled faster than anything Cedar Hollow had discussed in years. By the following week's Grange meeting, the mood in the hall was entirely different. Margaret walked in, later than usual, deliberately, letting the whispers settle before she took her seat. and felt dozens of eyes track her across the room with an entirely new kind of scrutiny. Not suspicion this time, something closer to nervous curiosity. Dwayne Halloran was the one who finally broke the silence, clearing his throat during the open comment period with noticeably less bravado than he'd carried 3 weeks earlier. "Margaret, heard there's been some government folks out at your place. Everything all right?" She let the question sit for a moment longer than necessary, savoring it, before she answered. "Everything's more than all right, Dwayne. Turns out that dead tree everyone wanted gone is home to a nesting pair of northern spotted owls, federally protected species. Fish and Wildlife's confirmed it's likely been an active nest site for at least 15 years. The silence that followed was so complete, Margaret could hear the old radiator ticking in the corner of the hall. "You're saying," Carol Ann said slowly, "that the tree can't come down?" "I'm saying," Margaret replied evenly, "that removing it, or even disturbing that nest during breeding season, would be a federal crime. I'm also saying that Fish and Wildlife has invited me to apply for a habitat conservation partnership through their landowner incentive program. Federal funding to help preserve and manage the site, along with technical support for sustainable grazing practices on the rest of the property. Apparently what everyone in this room has spent the last 3 weeks calling a liability and an eyesore is, according to actual biologists, one of the most ecologically significant pieces of private land in this entire valley." Dwayne's face went through several expressions in quick succession before settling on something like grudging respect. "Well, I'll be damned." "You might be," Margaret said, and didn't smile, though she wanted to. The following months brought changes to Cedar Hollow Farm that Margaret could never have anticipated on that gray October morning when she'd stood in her kitchen holding an unwanted casserole. Renata Cho became a regular presence on the property, and what began as a professional relationship slowly warmed into something like friendship. Together, they mapped a protective buffer zone around the nesting tree, adjusted the grazing rotation to keep cattle at a respectful distance during breeding season, and began documenting the broader ecosystem thriving in the margins of Margaret's land. The undisturbed hedgerows, the seasonal wetland at the property's northern edge, the old-growth remnants along the creek that Daniel had, for reasons Margaret now understood far better, always refused to clear. The landowner incentive program funding came through in early spring, providing Margaret with resources to fence off sensitive habitat areas, restore a degraded section of riparian corridor along the creek, and even install a remote camera system to monitor the owl nest without disturbing the birds. Footage that, much to Margaret's quiet delight, eventually showed 2 fledgling owls successfully leaving the nest that June. Tiny and awkward, and utterly unaware of the small miracle of their own survival, let alone the human drama their existence had ignited. Word of the discovery spread beyond Cedar Hollow. A reporter from the Boise paper drove out to do a feature story. "Widow's stubbornness saves rare owl habitat, wins federal recognition." And though Margaret found the headline faintly embarrassing, she couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction of watching Dwayne Halloran clip the article out of the paper and pin it, unprompted, to the corkboard at the Grange Hall. By late summer, the University Extension Office had begun referring other landowners to Margaret's farm as a model site for balancing working agricultural land with habitat conservation. Ranchers from 3 counties over driving into Walker Pastures ask about the fencing setup, the grazing rotation schedule, the paperwork for incentive programs they hadn't known existed. Margaret found herself improbably becoming something of a local authority, invited to speak at a regional agricultural sustainability conference in Boise about unexpected biodiversity on working ranch lands, a topic she would have laughed at anyone suggesting to her a year earlier. She still missed Daniel with an ache that never fully faded. Some mornings it caught her by surprise all over again, standing in the kitchen with her coffee, half expecting to hear his boots on the porch steps. But there was something healing too, in discovering this last quiet gift he'd left behind without ever explaining it to her. A stubborn insistence on protecting something the rest of the world had written off as worthless. A faith that patience and observation would eventually reveal value invisible to people in too much of a hurry to look closely. One evening in late September, almost a year to the day since she'd first stood in her kitchen holding Carol Ann's unwanted casserole, Margaret walked out to the east pasture alone, just as the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in long streaks of orange and violet. She stood beneath the old dead pine, no longer dead to her in any sense that mattered, its hollow trunk teeming with more life than half the healthy trees on the property, and watched as one of the adult owls glided silently out from the cavity, wings spread wide against the darkening sky, off to hunt in the last light of day. She thought about Dwayne's warning at that Grange meeting all those months ago. A woman alone can't let things slide, and found herself almost laughing at how completely, spectacularly wrong he'd turned out to be. She hadn't let anything slide. She'd simply refused to let anyone convince her that something quiet, patient, and unassuming was automatically worthless. It was a lesson she suspected that applied to more than just dead trees and empty pastures. It applied to widows too. To anyone the world had quietly written off as finished, simply because they'd stopped making noise. Margaret Voss stood in the gathering dusk, watching the owl disappear into the tree line, and for the first time since Daniel's death, felt something that wasn't quite happiness, but was perhaps its patient and quietly hopeful cousin. The sense of a woman who had been underestimated and who had, against every expectation stacked against her, been right all along. Behind her, the farmhouse lights flickered on in the twilight, hers now, fully and completely, in every sense that mattered. And ahead of her, in the tree that had nearly torn her small community apart, life continued exactly as it had for 15 quiet years before anyone bothered to notice. Patient, protected, and entirely unbothered by the noise of people who had never once thought to look up. The end.